What's up, guys? This is Heis, and welcome back to Stories from the Shop. Though this time the story is not really from the shop, it's not really from me. Details, it's fine. I had a coworker when I started at the BNSF Railway many moons ago who told me this story, and it's a story from his dad, but it's a little bit sad, a little bit funny, a little bit that's not something I ever would have thought a railroad would need to deal with, and therefore I thought it was fun to talk about, so let's get into it. So the BNSF Railway runs over primarily historic railroad routes. There's a number of different ones across the US, all kind of on the western end of things, but a couple of their routes are former Great Northern and Northern Pacific. They run across the north end of the country. One of those lines goes over Marias Pass near Glacier National Park, and it's a spectacular line to ride. The western part of Montana and that Rocky Mountain region is some of the prettiest scenery you will ever encounter. So if you've never ridden the Empire Builder, that's like the highlight section. It's just so cool. But today's story is about that very section of railroad and some unfortunate things that happened on that section of railroad. When I worked out of Inner Bay in Seattle with BNSF, the biggest thing that we did all the time was the big grainers, they would call it. A 14K grainer, aka 14,000 feet. So almost 3 miles of train as one grain train, running back and forth. The grain trains would run from places east, and they would come to Seattle, unload their things onto ships, and all of that stuff would be exported away. It's actually kind of surprising how much farming we do for the rest of the world, but that's actually a huge part of the business that the railroad does. In 2017, when we had record traffic, when I learned about this story, was actually amazing in how much was being exported away from us rather than us importing or just using our own things for us. So these gigantic 14,000 plus foot long trains would get built. They'd come to Seattle, they would unload their things at the harbor, they'd have to get rebuilt, retested, and then sent back to the grain elevators. And that was a huge thing. And along the way, they would run across the specific subdivision in Montana. And this is where the problem arose. Specifically in this case, a good friend of mine who I was a fellow trainee with, he told me this part of the story where there'd been a derailment where the grain train kind of tumbled down the hill. Montana, Glacier Park, the whole thing, very hilly territory, very non-stable in terms of slope kind of territory. A simple derailment where a couple wheels went off could quickly turn into half of the train tumbling down the mountain. Which, in this case, it did. And this was a westbound, a loaded grain train that was coming to the port to offload things and put them on ships. And as such, if you can imagine a giant cylindrical hopper car tumbling down the mountain, not all the grain stayed inside. Things got punctured, things broke open, grain went everywhere. Nasty mess. Thankfully, no one was hurt at that time. They recovered the cars, scrapped the ones that broke, and dealt with the ones that, were not so bad. Now, the challenge was that the grain had spilled everywhere. And that may seem kind of not a big deal. It's grain, it's natural, it'll decompose, no big deal. Who cares? There's no real connotations or problems with that happening. You could just kind of leave it there. And that was what the original thought was. And this is one of those things that implemented a new rule involving, hey, no matter how far the car tumbled down the hill, you gotta go pick it up. And specifically what I mean when I say this is that grain that sits out and then perhaps gets damp and then perhaps sits there for some time, ferments. This is what creates alcohol, whether it be whiskey, beer, whatever, in a more controlled process. Still makes that sort of thing happen just out in the wild, in the middle of nowhere, Montana, in a national park. And unfortunately, that attracted some very large fuzzy customers. Grizzly Bears started to show up to the site, and they came upon all this grain that had fermented and they started to eat it because, goodness, we've been given food that is just here on the floor. We don't have to kill things, don't have to do anything. It's right here. It's been presented to us on not necessarily a platter, but there it be. And so the grizzly bears would eat the fermented grain, and then they would get drunk because it was literally alcohol that they were eating / drinking. I'm sure it was some kind of slurry. And then the grizzly bears would go about their business. Well, here's where the problem comes in. This part of Montana is very remote. There's not a whole ton of people out there. It's all the wildlife. And so these drunken, stumbling grizzly bears would be wandering around, just going about their business, and they might happen themselves upon the main line. And it's one of the busier main lines in the United States, at least as far as the West Coast and the west side of things in the US is concerned. And the grizzly bears might end up staying there for too long, or if they hear and see a train, maybe they didn't know what to do. And in many cases, the sun beating down upon two steel rails warms them up really nice, and a grizzly bear wanting to take a nice place to take a nap would sit between the rails and just have this nice warm bed. Yeah. So the trains ended up running into and killing many grizzly bears. I think the number is over 60 in the past 20-30 years, which on the grand scheme of things is pretty low, but still an unfortunate thing. But the reality is that specifically from this one wreck that happened, so many grizzly bears got drunk and then were unable to run out of the way because they were drunk when the train appeared at that specific point, that the railroad's actually taken several lawsuits for this. It's kind of a hilarious thing. What was on your docket for? Oh, what are we going to get sued for? Oh, well, you're running over the drunk grizzly bears. That was not on anyone's plate. That was not on anyone's thought process. Like, oh yeah, that's a thing that'll happen as a business risk of being a railroad. Running over drunk grizzly bears. Strange, interesting, and of course, nowadays, things have been changed so much. They do a much better job of remediating not just the train cars that they had to scrap and deal with, but also cleaning up all of the contents that they spill, even if they're natural. It was a reasonable assumption to go, oh, well, it's natural to decompose, but not before it became something that the grizzly bear could not resist. And so, thankfully, things have changed significantly since this incident occurred, but it's like, you had one big train derailment, caused a bunch of bears to get drunk. The bears went in and had a nice nap on the railroad and then, unfortunately, got run over. What a bizarre set of circumstances. I can think of nothing quite like it out there. So, anyways, not my story, friend of mine's story, but still an interesting and fun one in terms of what happens on the railroad. That's not something you'd ever be equipped to deal with. Just bizarre, off the wall, fun, yet sad. I mean, obviously, you don't want to see any wildlife deal with those sorts of things, and that's a bummer. But at the same time, the number is relatively low enough, but the thought of, oh yeah, big drunk grizzly bear, well, he was having a good time. Right up until you didn't. So, anyway, strange one, fun one. Hope you enjoyed this story. Thanks so much for watching, guys. We'll catch y'all next time.